Could this bring Keir Starmer down? It certainly exposes an absolute whopping scandal involving the Prime Minister and his whole coterie, his goons, if you will. This really is sensational stuff, honestly, and it's a big honour to be joined by Paul Holden, who has a new devastating book out, which is very appropriately called The Fraud, which is obviously all about the Starmer project. Paul, firstly, great to see you. How are you doing?
I'm very good. Thanks for having me on.
It's a big honour to have you. Let's just start. So this book you've just published, which has already made a lot of waves. It's had a huge amount of coverage in the weeks running up to publication. And I understand was causing panic in number 10. So, we can all get a bit of schadenfreude out of that. Can you just give a broad brush before I just talk? I want to go talk through some of the kind of the actual kind of grim details of it all. Mm-hmm. What's the broad brush kind of conclusions of this book about what we're dealing with in terms of the Starmer project, if you want?
Sure. I mean, the book is a sort of almost a decade-long history, really, looking at the Labour Party and Keir Starmer's rise to power from 2015 to 2025, really taking up to the end of his end of his first year in power. And the idea behind it was to explore the sort of incredible levels of deception, dishonesty, and illegality that drove him to power. What we see is, the campaign that brought him to power, the organization that brought him to power, was doing so through a whole series of incredibly despicable secret campaigns funded with undeclared money. And then when that campaign succeeded in installing Keir Starmer as the leader of the Labour Party, then took over the party and engaged in this just absolutely terrifying, I call it almost like an orgy of misconduct and factionalism, in totally remaking the party in the image of this tiny little censorious authoritarian faction that has its roots in this campaign funded by illegal money, but which is sought to transform the party in their image. And as we're seeing, it's an image that the general public pretty much despises, and I think could potentially destroy the Labour Party in the long term.
It's big stuff there. I mean, there's already been, let's just be clear, just so people can kind of, just in terms of what we're dealing with, there's already been resignations caused by this book.
Yes, so Paul Holden, who was the director of strategy in Number 10 and was very close to Morgan Sweeney and apparently quite close to Keir Starmer, resigned because I took, about 4 weeks ago now, I took copies of messages that I had access to, showing Paul Holden exchanging text messages about Diane Abbott, internal party server messages about Diane Abbott, and as soon as that hit Number 10, there was a managed process, and eventually he left. And that happened pretty rapidly and unexpectedly. I just got a text message from somebody just saying, Overton's resigned, before the story that I was working on even had come out. I was doing it with ITV, and an hour before the ITV story came out, I got that message. So plainly there was a very rapid decision to resolve his place in the party.
Disgusting messages, I should say, highly sexualized messages about the first black female politician in the country, who the Labour Party have treated abominably. They've now suspended twice, and she's been suspended again, but used her as a fundraising opportunity when a Conservative donor talked about having delighting in the idea of her being shot and so on. Just in terms of, let's talk about Labour Together. What is... Sure. When we talk about Labour Together, what was it for and what happened?
So originally Labour Together had relatively noble motives. So it was founded in 2015 by John Cruddas, who was the motive force behind it. And John Cruddas, who is sort of associated with the blue Labour tendency of the party, he formed it because he was concerned that the election of Jeremy Corbyn would lead to a split in the party, that right-wing MPs in particular, who always refused to accept Jeremy Corbyn's leadership, would split away, and then the Labour Party would face electoral oblivion, really, at that point. So Labour Together was set up with the idea of trying to stop that from happening by making sure that people were talking to each other, engaging in conversations, in dialogue, trying to heal the splits in the party. So that was what they actually did, and that was the noble stuff they did to begin with. But it changes fundamentally in June 2017, and effectively the trigger is that election, the general election 2017, because for people like Morgan McSweeney, who are from like a Blairite right-wing faction of the Labour Party, that was a disaster. The fact that the Labour Party did much better than expected was a disaster. They all expected that Jeremy Corbyn was going to fail as soon as he met the public for the first time, and then they could remove him. Instead, at that stage, Jeremy Corbyn is effectively unassailable in the Labour Party. Morgan McSweeney comes into Labour Together and he totally transforms it internally. So he uses their public persona that they've already created as a cross-factional party think tank that's going to resolve the issues of factionalism. What he's actually doing is he's plotting with a couple of insiders, and the primary insiders there, the sort of key person is Steve Reid MP, who's his closest political ally for a long period of time. And they take Labour Together and they transform it. And it's effectively used for two purposes. The one is to specifically undermine the leadership of Jeremy Corbyn and, as Gabriel Coggan points out, to effectively achieve that, you have to make sure the Labour Party loses at the next general elections. They're undermining the party with that intention, or that's certainly what Coggan says. Then they are incubating the next leader. So even as early as 2017, they say, once we've completed this task, we will choose the next leader of the Labour Party and we will guide them to power. And effectively, that is Keir Starmer in July 2019. As they're not declaring donations, they choose Keir Starmer and they incubate a leadership campaign. And then they effectively drive him to become the leader of the Labour Party.
So, I mean, what happens with Labour Together? What are the kind of big, sort of scandalous developments?
Sure. So the big one, obviously, is the money, and that's sort of been covered in the press already. What happens is that between early 2018 and sort of mid-2020, Labour Together takes in £740,000 in donations, which is failing to report in line with electoral law. And it doesn't report them at all. It doesn't make those filings. The public has no idea they're taking that money. And that's a pretty serious violation. And that's not an opinion that's fact. That's cold hard fact, because the Electoral Commission did investigate them in 2021 and found them guilty of that offence, which is obviously an unlawful act, and then fined them £14,000. So for the entire time they're doing these projects, they're doing so funded with this pot of money. They're not declaring in line with the law. Now, obviously, I report that in the book, but then I raise additional questions. And there's additional questions for me that arise from it. And the one is, well, Morgan McSweeney is supposed to be this genius, this absolute, electoral guru who delivers Keir Starmer to leadership of the Labour Party.
And just so people are aware,
sure.
Yeah, just so people are aware, he's the chief of staff. Just so people are aware, he's the chief of staff now, and he ran Keir Starmer's leadership campaign in 2020.
That's right. So Morgan McSweeney is Keir Starmer's current chief of staff, and Andrew Marr calls him the most powerful man in Labour Party history, which I found a bit chilling. He was also the head of Keir Starmer's election Labour leadership campaign, and he was chief of staff in Starmer's Lotto, Leaders of the Opposition office, for about a year as well. But he effectively ran pretty much all the election campaigns that got Starmer elected, first as Labour leader, then as Prime Minister, and then now he effectively runs the country as the most powerful unelected person behind Keir Starmer. And the questions I raise in relation to the money are quite simple. It's like, is this a big mistake? That's what Labour Together have said. It was just an administrative oversight and human error. And I've looked at the available evidence and said, well, how plausible is that explanation? And my argument, which I've couched very carefully in the book, is that I think it's just as plausible that there was a decision not to report those donations. And I mobilize some evidence to support that contention. I'll give you some flavors of that if I can. But one thing that I discovered was that I put in some FOI requests to the Electoral Commission in 2023, and they gave me a set of correspondence between Morgan McSweeney and the Electoral Commission. And what it shows is that in November 2017, Morgan McSweeney called the Electoral Commission and said to them, I don't think we should have to report donations as Labour Together. We're not public facing. We're not a campaigning organisation. And as a result, I don't think we should report donations. And the Electoral Commission wrote back to him and said, no, we've had a look. You're a members association because you have MPs on your board. You absolutely have to report donations. Not only do you have to report donations, this is when you have to report donations. This is how you report donations. These are the forms you use to report donations. This is how you fill the forms in. And then there's an extended correspondence over a couple of months where Morgan McSweeney, because he keeps on making mistakes in the way he fills in the forms, they're repeatedly writing to him and telling him, this is how you do it. And it's very clear that Morgan McSweeney is utterly aware the entire time that he has to report to nations. Those are incontrovertible from that correspondence, that Morgan McSweeney is aware that he needs to report to nations. Absolutely clear. And then he's telling people he's reporting donations. So one thing is the Labour Together website says from April 2019, we are reporting all donations, and has a link to the Electoral Commission website. He has a meeting with MPs in Parliament in 2019 where he specifically asked, are you reporting donations? Is Labour Together required to report donations? And he says, yes, that we are required to report donations, and we are reporting donations. And then again in February 2020, Shabana Mahmood, now the Home Secretary, writes an article on behalf of Labour Together and says, by the way, we are this organization. We are not backing Keir Starmer's election campaign, which is actually not true according to their own version of events. And also we report on our donations. Have a look over here. So repeatedly throughout this time, he knows he has to report donations and he's not reporting donations. He's telling people he's reporting donations and he's not reporting donations. And then the third factor is we know internally within Labour Together, he distributed this document, which is a planning document in July 2017, where he sets out the plan to recapture the Labour Party. And he says, this is what we need to do. We need to destroy the left wing and its left-wing media ecosystem around it, and then choose the next leader. And one of the biggest threats he identifies in that document is that they will be discovered, that somebody will discover what they're really doing. Now, you have somebody who's told he has to report donations and is also running an entirely secret campaign based on an elaborate process of material misdirection, disinformation in the public, saying we are a cross-factional party organization when actually they're doing all this stuff secretly. They're terrified of being discovered for what they do. And what do? They don't report all the donations that are being made by figures on the right wing associated with the right wing of the Labour Party, associated with anti-Corbyn causes. So no one has any idea during this period of time they're doing all this secret stuff, basically changing British politics in ways that I think are for the worse. Nobody knows. Nobody has any idea. And I think that questions need to be asked about whether that was helpful to them and was helpful to their project for people not to know. And that might have been the reason why Morgan McSweeney repeatedly reminded of the need to report donations and repeatedly telling people he was reporting donations didn't report donations.
Now, what was often called the anti-Semitism crisis in inverted quotes, particularly raging from 2018 was 2019 was its big peak, really, I would say. Can you explain what are your kind of main findings? And then obviously we see later, we'll come on to what happens in terms of what then happens with the EHRC report into Labour in 2020, which then leads to Jeremy Corbyn being suspended from the Labour Party. But tell us about what you found about the anti-Semitism crisis, in quotes.
Sure, and I think I should just say up front that obviously this is an extremely complex, nuanced issue. And I've already been asked questions about it. And I think just to say up front, the position of the book is not that the anti-Semitism crisis was all a big hoax and that it was all a big scam. What I say is that it was a very complex issue where there was a mixture of legitimate concerns that were being expressed about anti-Semitism in the Labour Party that needed to be dealt with, and then concerns that were alarmist in tone and created, I thought, an undue sense of panic about the level of anti-Semitism in the Labour Party and where it came from. Now, the thing that is very problematic about the anti-Semitism crisis, and I center on this allegation of denialism. The way the anti-Semitism crisis played out was that, there were a whole bunch of news stories in 2017 and 2018 in particular. So the mural gate, the stuff about the wreath, all sorts of stories about random councillors sharing Rothschild's memes, which created in one version of events this absolutely undeniable bedrock of facts. And if you questioned the scale of anti-Semitism in the Labour Party, then you're a denialist and you're an anti-Semite yourself. The problem with that is that there's so many examples where, amidst the very serious allegations that we had to take seriously, there were nonsense allegations that shouldn't be taken seriously. Yeah. And then in those contexts, people would come across those nonsense allegations and say to themselves, well, this is clearly a complex issue. We need to discuss it. We need to have a serious conversation about how we determine the scale of anti-Semitism in the Labour Party. Denialism killed that. Denialism said that if you even question this at all, you are de facto an anti-Semite. loads of Jewish people who questioned the scale of anti-Semitism in the Labour Party and who had questions of the way it was being prosecuted and for what reasons. They were then called anti-Semitic because they were denialist. And then people who defended them were denialists. Now, the reason I bring this up is because what we see is that in the entire period between 2018 in particular, up until the end of 2020, while Morgan McSweeney is running this Labour Together project, not declaring his donations, he's also engaging in the anti-Semitism crisis. And what I mean by that is that he is working with journalists to place stories behind a veil of anonymity, to place stories in the media in particular, alleging widespread anti-Semitism in the Labour Party. His colleague is a guy called Imran Ahmad, who works very closely to him. He's now the CEO of the Centre for Countering Digital Hate. And they are working together to basically place stories in the media. Now, the problem with that is this is a campaign where they have specifically said they are setting out to destroy Corbynism. They're going to destroy Jeremy Corbyn. They're funded with this undeclared money. They have this animus towards the left where they said the left is effectively evil and they despise the left. And at the same time, they're mobilizing claims of anti-Semitism, which if you look at them, half of them don't stack up, right? So then the question becomes, well, how do we make sense of this? And one of the big issues in the anti-Semitism crisis is there were a lot of people who are saying, well, we understand there's a legitimate organic issue that has to be dealt with, but we also feel like there's something else happening here, that there's a hidden hand of some kind that is maybe working to make it seem worse than it actually is, or to weaponize it for political ends. And the thing is, there was a hidden hand. There actually was a hidden hand. And this is what the Labour Together project was. It was an undisclosed campaign by people who despise Corbynism, pretending in public to be working for factional unity, not declaring their money, who are at the same time actually seeding key aspects of the anti-Semitism crisis. And they were doing material things. It's not just media articles. They were working with the Jewish labor movement to help them refine their submission to the HRC. And as I showed, they're also getting these like horrific AstroTurf projects as well to police denialism, which I can speak about if you'd like to hear about that as well.
Yeah, I mean, could you talk about these AstroTurf campaigns? So just unpack that a bit.
Sure. So, I mean, what I mean by an AstroTurf campaign, an AstroTurf campaign is a campaign, a public campaign to change something in the public mind or achieve some sort of campaign objective where the people present themselves as being grassroots activists when they're actually sort of corporate or political actors. And what Morgan McSweeney and Imran Ahmad do is in March 2019, they set up a thing called Stop Funding Fake News, which is a Twitter account and a website. And what they're seeking to do through that is they accuse a whole bunch they accuse two left-wing websites of publishing misinformation, fake news, and hate. And they present this evidence. The way they present themselves is just a group of activists, just a bunch of friends fighting hate and misinformation in the public domain, when in fact, who are they? It's Morgan McSweeney, former Labour Party employee, funded with huge amounts of money from millionaire donors. Imran Ahmad, who's a former Labour Party staffer, working with him in the Labour Together offices, and apparently with the knowledge of Steve Reid, who's a sitting MP. This is about as far away from a group of grassroots activists as you can possibly imagine, right? So they run this campaign for months. We're just a bunch of grassroots activists, never reveal who they are. And they start accusing the Canary and Evolve Politics in particular of fake news and misinformation and anti-Semitism. They go through, deep dives into the individual authors and accuse them of anti-Semitism. And what I do in the book is, I highlight just how insane it is that we have a chief of staff to the prime minister who would, even think of engaging in a project like this. This is such like a manifestly mad, insane, I think unethical thing to be doing. But then you also look at the claims they make, and they don't make any sense. So they go after the Canary and say, the Canary publishes fake news, and they give all these examples. And the examples are actually ludicrous. They really are. They just don't stand up at all. And I'll give you one example, is that they post this one thread about a Canary journalist called Emily Apple, who's also now currently the spokesperson for the campaign against the arms trade and has done great work around on Israel and Gaza. And they say she's anti-Semitic because in 2011, which is 8 years before Stop Funding Fake News, she posts on Facebook or on Twitter, Israel is a C word, and then posts a link to a protest because it's just after Israel has attacked one of the first flotillas and killed a whole bunch of activists on board. Now, Emily Apple's father is Jewish. She's written very movingly about how she has Jewish heritage, about how it's her Jewish heritage that's informed her work fighting oppression and colonialism and the horrors of the arms trade, right? This is nonsense, this idea that an entire media organization has to be delegitimized and demonetized because a woman who's written movingly about her own Jewish identity has said Israel's a C word. That is the substance, and that is the harshest and the most like well evidenced allegation they have, right? Stuff is really poorly researched. Now, what's going to be a problem for them is, obviously I think that's extremely problematic. What it does do, quite a lot of the evidence they point to, one of the examples they give is they share a Canary article which says Jewish Labour members are upset about the anti-Semitism crisis. And that article is in interviews with loads of Jewish members of the Labour Party who say we feel discomforted by the way the anti-Semitism crisis is being run. So the Canary is being accused of anti-Semitism and fake news for interviewing Jewish people about their own experience of anti-Semitism in the Labour Party. Now, what's going to be really problematic for them is that in this campaign, they also target right-wing websites. They target Westminster, which is Aaron Bank's website. They target the Brexit Party as well, and have this very material intervention in May 2019, very problematic, ahead of the European elections, where they say, do not vote for the Brexit Party. They're using an AstroTurf campaign created by Morgan McSweeney and Imran Ahmed in the Labour Together office while they're not declaring money to tell people who and who not to vote for. And of course, I'm not a Brexit Party supporter. I'm not a Reform supporter. But now what you can have legitimately Nigel Farage can get up and say, the Chief of Staff to the Prime Minister tried to censor outlets that reported favourably on me and my party. They tried to cancel me. And that is true. And that is a nightmare. If you are somebody like me who is concerned about Reform and Farage, this is a nightmare to give them this gift, right? And I suppose this is my I don't know if you have many centrist people who watch the show, but my message to people who are more centrally aligned is to say, look at these people. These people are so utterly reckless in the way they behave. They're so utterly reckless the way they've launched this campaign. They haven't thought at all about the long-term consequences for themselves, for the Labour Party, for democracy, in launching a campaign like this. And they've gifted Nigel Farage something amazing. The other thing they do, mad thing they do, is they demonetize Breitbart. They start going after Steve Bannon. Now, I'm, again, not a fan of Steve Bannon, not a fan of Breitbart, obviously. But it's not going to take too long, I don't think, before the White House starts saying, hold on a second, the Chief of Staff to the Prime Minister made sure that Breitbart didn't get any UK government advertising or advertising from the Cabinet Office. The Chief of Staff to the Prime Minister launched a censorship campaign against one of Trump's biggest backers. Like, how do you think that's going to go down at the White House when that finally clicks? Like, I think that's going to be a problem for them. And I think that's going to be, I just think it's crazy. It's just absolutely insane. And it just shows how utterly reckless they've been. And that's before they've gotten Keir Starmer elected as leader of the Labour Party. That's all the prehistory. That's the first 100 pages of my book. My book is 500 pages.
Well, maybe Donald Trump has read your book, Ben. That explains why he humiliated Keir Starmer this week at the summit when he invited him to the microphone and then sent him back, maybe. And he also said there are some people in this room who I don't like very much. In fact, quite a lot of people that you'll never know who you are. Or maybe you will. Maybe he means that. Maybe he means that, Paul. Let's just, in terms of what happens, in terms of just talk about just in terms of Keir Starmer taking over the Labour Party and what we've learned from how, because look, with Morgan McSweeney, who is the most powerful man in the country, I think, very arguably. I mean, they briefed Keir Starmer's aides to the two Times journalists, Patrick Maguire and Gabriel Pogrund, for their book. They boasted, among other things, that Keir Starmer thought he was driving the train, but they'd actually sat him in front of the driverless District Light Railway, basically portraying him as a useful idiot. Extraordinary, I have to say, to brief this just months after Labour have won an election, albeit on a third of the vote. But nonetheless, you kind of like they're briefing against their boss, saying he's an absolute clown show. Who basically is just told to does as he's told. So Morgan McSweeney's the guy running the place. So tell me about that. Tell me about that leadership campaign where we know Keir Starmer made promises like public nationalisation, tax the rich, scratch tuition fees, defend migrants' rights, peace and justice abroad, all these things he violated. But what else do we know about that campaign?
So the first thing to acknowledge about the campaign is it is fundamentally rooted in this Labour Together project that I've just described. So what we know is that at least in about April 2018, Keir Starmer is thinking about a potential leadership challenge down the line. He forms this thing called the Arlington Group, which meets in Camden, named after Arlington Road, where Jenny Chapman, I think, used to live. I don't know if she still does live there. And the discussion, Steve Reed is part of that group as well. And it's sort of a light, sort of incubating potentially leadership challenge. But things fundamentally change in July 2019 because Morgan McSweeney is invited to a meeting of the Arlington Group. And what Morgan McSweeney does is one of the things that Labour Together has spent its huge amount of money doing is polling the Labour Party membership. Now, apparently, they spent more on polling than the Tory and the Labour Party combined. I mean, I don't know if that's true. It seemed like an astonishing thing if it is true. What we do know is they spent a lot of money on polling the Labour Party membership. They knew exactly what the Labour Party membership looked like, what they wanted from a future leader. And Morgan McSweeney presents this presentation. He said, this is how you win the Labour Party. And he identifies all these segments of the Labour Party and how to pitch the message. And then, of course, when Jeremy Corbyn's Labour Party loses, Keir Starmer's campaign is right there ready to run. Amongst the things that they have already sorted out are Keir Starmer's funders, who are also, incidentally, in some cases, the funders of Labour Together, who have not been declared at the time. Morgan McSweeney comes in as the campaign manager. And they run what is quite clearly a very polished campaign of finding out exactly what the Labour Party members want. The Labour Party leaned very left at the time. And presented the image of Keir Starmer as that. And that means that they presented Keir Starmer as this eco-socialist radical who was embedded within a human rights environmentalist tradition, who is a follower of the Corbynite tradition. He says, the 2017 manifesto is our foundational document, makes, a massive welter of commitments. And when they say, Keir Starmer is just a puppet, I had this amazing discovery once, just this really incredible thing that I found, was that I spent way too much time reading Keir Starmer's campaign website. And he used to have this thing on his campaign website called Reform and Unite, I think it was, which is this platform of how he was going to reform, unite the party, and had all these policy proposals. And it has this long preamble about, reconciliation is the heart of justice and all these things. And I remember reading it thinking, this sounds so familiar. Where do I know this from? And I realized that the only video I've ever found of Morgan McSweeney speaking in public. This is crazy to me. This guy is the most powerful person in the public domain. Never done an interview that we can read. There's only one video I've ever found. And he's reading a speech to these people in 2019 where he's pretending he's using the Labour Together face as, we're unifying face. And he reads the speech. And the speech is word for word what appears on Keir Starmer's leadership platform 6 months later. It's literally, you have, I read it and I was like, oh my word, he's like a robot. Like there's a script that's been written and it's being repeated. It is astonishing. And there's other text that's taken directly from the Labour Together website. And it's plain, this is a deeply factional project. This is a project that absolutely despises Corbyn. They think, according to Gabriel Pogren and Patrick Maguire, they think Corbynism is evil. They think Corbynites are evil. And yet this is a project that's delivering a leader who's saying, I'm going to reconcile with the Corbynites, we can all work together, I'm the inheritor of the Corbynite tradition. It's nonsense. And that's plainly what happens, is that, when Keir Starmer takes over as leader, all of the promises he's made, all the pledges he's made are put by the wayside. Now, I'll give you, and I'm answering quite long, but my publisher said to me, wouldn't it be great if we did a table or a spreadsheet of all the things that Keir Starmer committed to, all the principles he espoused during the leadership campaign, and then see if he stuck to them, and we'll put them in the book. And I said, sure, I'll do that. And I spent way too long reading pretty much everything that Keir Starmer said on the leadership campaign and putting together this table. And it was so long, I can't fit it in the book. It's so long, it made the book too long. So we've actually had to put up the table on our website that supports the book. Right? That's the level of
That's useful. That's
useful. So everybody can now go and download this table of everything he said to leadership campaign and how it doesn't stack up, right? And the key thing there, his defenders say, the world has changed and he couldn't do the things he promised. It's like, well, how has the world changed so much that he made a promise to abolish the House of Lords in 2020 and now he's using the House of Lords to appoint peers who he then parachutes into his cabinet, right? What has changed in the world that has suddenly made the House of Lords not anti-democratic, not like an offense to democracy like he said it was. Suddenly, it's not this bastion of democracy? That doesn't make any sense. He says repeatedly in the campaign, one of his key lines is like defining lines. If it's bad for the environment, it's bad for the economy. There's no such thing as being bad for the environment, but good for the economy. And then, of course, when he becomes leader, one of the big tests is these gas licenses up in the North Sea. It's like, well, I don't think we should set them aside. I think we should see them through if they've been signed. It's like, well, you just said that if it's bad for the environment, it'll be bad for the economy. Now you're saying, well, because it's good for the economy, it doesn't matter that it's bad for the environment. These are incommensurate beliefs. They're not a movement. They're not on a spectrum. They are totally the opposite beliefs and principles to what he's espoused before. It's not policy pledges, it's beliefs and principles. And that's the key thing. He presents principles of who he is in 2020, which he then presents as completely different principles thereafter. And that's sort of the heart of the deception of the campaign.
Another example I often cite, by the way, is where in the campaign he makes a solemn commitment to nationalisation, and when asked by Andrew Neil, the then BBC presenter, interviewer, that will nationalisation of utilities be in the next manifesto, he said, "I've made it, it's a commitment." And then 2 years later, the BBC presenter Laura Kunnersberg asked him about nationalisation. He said, "I never committed to nationalisation. I never committed to nationalisation." That's an example that's just a clear-cut lie, because he can't say, he's not saying changing circumstances. He's not going, well, I did, yes, obviously that's a matter of public record. Yes, of course, I supported nationalisation. That's obviously in my manifesto. But now we don't have the money or whatever. He didn't do that. He just said he never said that when he did. That's the thing. Anyway, he's just a big, massive liar. He's a liar. I can call him a liar there, just as a fact. Unless he's the most forgetful man possible. He can't remember the key planks of his leadership campaign. The man is a liar. That's a fact. Just in terms of what happens with the Equality and Human Rights Commission, which, I should point out was founded under the last Labour government a long time ago, and is not politically neutral. I just want to make that clear, because what happens is the government has the ability to appoint members of its board, and some of those people are just, as a matter of fact, have classically right-wing views on various issues to do with identity, for example. That's just a matter of public record. What the EHRC does this report on anti-Semitism in the Labour Party, and it has let's just be clear, just an interesting finding. But whatever you think about that finding, Keir Starmer's team go on and violate that finding. Just explain, what am I talking about?
Yeah, right. Okay, so the EHRC investigates the Labour Party. It's looking into the Labour Party, how it handles complaints of anti-Semitism between 2016 and 2020. We now know, of course, during this period of time, that Morgan McSweeney is playing quite a key role in helping to facilitate the complaints to the EHRC. And so when the EHRC makes its findings, the bureaucracy that he's installed and the leader he's installed decides to accept the EHRC's findings. And the key finding there, and I should say in the book, I'm extremely critical of the EHRC report, because they make a whole series of very basic factual errors that are really sort of head-smackingly stupid about the Labour Party. But be that as may, what the EHRC says is that the Labour Party is guilty of indirect discrimination against Jewish people. And the way they make that finding is to say that when complaints were made about anti-Semitism in the Labour Party, the leader's office, or the leadership, which was Jeremy Corbyn's office and the people he was working with, intervened in specific anti-Semitism complaints. And that act of intervening, which they call political interference, prejudiced or discriminated against Jewish people, because Jewish people might then wonder whether the cases were being dealt with fairly, right? That's the finding. It's a finding that I don't necessarily agree with, but the point is that the Labour Party under Keir Starmer accepts it. And then Keir Starmer then delivers an address. He delivers this incredibly serious speech about accepting the HSC report, and this is a stain on our history. It's deeply serious. And he says, they found political interference. It's a real problem. I commit from now on, the deputy leader and the leader will never have any outcome and any handling of any anti-Semitism complaints done through the party system. And what I found is that this is just nonsense, because actually before the HRC's finding, Keir Starmer's office is materially involved in like a pretty systematic interference in anti-Semitism complaints. In fact, they do it on a proactive basis. He's so involved, in fact, that Keir Starmer is getting case-by-case updates on specific individuals sent to him weekly in pre-formatted reports to his personal email address, also copied into Morgan McSweeney, also sent to Angela Rayner, right? The staff who are working there at the time are clearly operating under the assumption that they have to expel all these 20 people. They've been given a list of 20 people who've been accused of anti-Semitism and told, find something to get these people out of the party. All the staff who are working in the Labour Party at the time are very clear it's being done at the direction of the leader's office. They're very clear that every decision they make is being reported to the leader's office. They're very clear that they have to find something to get rid of these people. It is the essence of political interference. It really is. And then, I mean, you could say, well, maybe they didn't know at the time. Of course, that doesn't, nobody would expect that to absolve Jeremy Corbyn, who, didn't have the HRC report when he was in power. But then immediately after, half an hour after they accept the HRC report, they're violating that. Because Jeremy Corbyn put out a statement saying, I think, he says that there are some people inside and outside of the party who've overstated anti-Semitism. Now, it's a mind-bending moment in history for me, in Labour Party history. Because I think actually I criticize Jeremy Corbyn for putting out that statement because I think it was politically insensitive at the time. It wasn't well thought through. There were lots of people in the Jewish community who understood the HRC report to be legitimate, and he maybe could have timed it better or worded it better. But be that as may, basically what he is describing when he says there are people inside and outside of the party working to overstate the existence of anti-Semitism or to make those allegations recklessly, he is literally describing what Morgan McSweeney was doing for years behind the scenes. And now it's Morgan McSweeney who's going to sit in a room with Keir Starmer and Angela Rayner and materially intervene in his complaint, in his suspension, half an hour after they said that doing so is a terrible slight on the Jewish community, right? And what I have all these internal Labour Party emails, which shows Jeremy Corbyn's suspension letter, right, is sent to Jeremy Corbyn. The literal minute it leaves the Labour Party inbox, I think it's 1:03, it is tweeted out that he's been suspended. So before Jeremy Corbyn could even possibly open his email saying he's been suspended, it's being tweeted out that he's been suspended. Jeremy Corbyn only finds out 2 hours after he's been suspended, he's doorstepped. In that time, the suspension letter suspending him has been sent to Morgan McSweeney and everybody else in the leader's office. And then over an extended period of time, Keir Starmer directs Morgan McSweeney to basically negotiate a settlement, which again is the essence of political interference. Now, this speaks to a whole bunch of things. I think it's actually one of the most serious things I think I've uncovered in this book, because on the one hand, if you accept the HRC report, which the Labour Party does, that means it's very clear. These are clear examples of political interference. It means clearly Keir Starmer's Labour Party is guilty of indirectly discriminating against British Jewish people. That's a very serious thing. If they want to take the HRC report seriously, if the Labour Party wants to take its own fight against anti-Semitism seriously, it now must start asking questions. Why are you accepting the fact that Keir Starmer's leader's office materially intervened in complaints when you've accepted that was a form of indirect discrimination? But what I also think it speaks to is, I make the allegation, the problem with the anti-Semitism crisis is that there are lots of people. I think there are people who make the allegation of anti-Semitism recklessly, basically, who made it too easily on certain occasions, and did it without the due evidence, or without, I think in ways that don't really stand scrutiny. And a good example of this is Steve Reed, right? Because Steve Reed in May 2020 submits a list of 10 individuals to the Labour Party and says, these 10 individuals, I want you to suspend them and investigate them for anti-Semitism. Of those 10 individuals, 4 are Jewish. Right. So 40% of the complaints that Steve Reed has decided to submit into the Labour Party are Jewish. And I've had a look at those complaints, and I've had a look at the responses of those people to those complaints, and they are devastating. Because what you have is Jewish people who are so deeply upset at being accused of anti-Semitism, writing these incredibly moving letters in response, being like, you do not understand anti-Semitism. If you understood what anti-Semitism actually is, that it's this thousands-year oppression of Jewish people through the European tradition, that it includes the Holocaust, that it includes one of the people they accuse is a guy called Professor Jonathan Rosenhead, who's at LSE, an anti-apartheid activist. He's also incidentally anti-Zionist. And he writes this incredible letter in response to them. And he says, you got to understand, my whole father's family was wiped out in the Holocaust, right? All we knew when I was growing up, all of my father's friends and my family's friends were Jewish. And the reason they were all Jewish is because we understand, I love this phrase uses, we understood the provisionality of tolerance. That's what we were taught. We understood that the tolerance of the Jewish community was always provisional in our history, right? And that they always lived in fear of that tolerance being withdrawn. And they lived with that fear their whole lives. And then he says, if you understand that deep understanding of what anti-Semitism is, and then you accuse me, a Jewish person, of being anti-Semitic, you do not understand anti-Semitism. You do not understand what anti-Semitism is. And actually, in the end, Jonathan Rosenhead is so upset by that experience, he resigns from the Labour Party. I mean, it's an absurd, outrageous story, the way he's treated. And I'm afraid to say, it's not a nice thing I have to do in the book, but on multiple occasions I tell the story. I mean, if you don't mind, I'd like to tell one more, if that's okay, to give an illustrative example. I end the section on the HRC report because what I think is the way that anti-Semitism in the Labour Party was treated by all factions, but I think particularly by the Labour Party's right wing, was it produced all these incredibly toxic, malignant outcomes. One of those toxic, malignant outcomes was the number of Jewish people who are repeatedly, almost systematically accused of anti-Semitism in the Labour Party, which I think is outrageous. And the example that I have in the book, and it still sometimes it upsets me so much when I read this example, is a woman by the name of Riva Joffe. And Riva Joffe lived in Keir Starmer's constituency, was part of the Labour Party, knew Keir Starmer personally, went to branch meetings and CLP meetings. And she's accused of anti-Semitism in 2021. And she receives her accusation of anti-Semitism on her deathbed, literally on her deathbed. She's got a couple of days left to live. She's been suffering from like a terminal illness. And she was this, very vivacious woman. And she's basically talking about how she gets this letter accusing of anti-Semitism. And the allegation against her, accusing of anti-Semitism, is that she called Israel an apartheid state. Right? She has to answer on her deathbed the allegation against anti-Semitic. That's it. But she has basically said that Israel is an apartheid state. So it's one of the last things she does before she dies is that she writes this letter and she says, what are you thinking? What are you thinking doing? What are you doing? Of course I'm not anti-Semite. This is a mad thing to send me. And this is one of the last things she has to do in her life. Now, I have the party files that show how their complaint was initiated. One of the complainants in her case was a man by the name of David Goldstein. David Goldstein is not real. David Goldstein is a made-up name. David Goldstein is the made-up name and identity of a man by the name of Ewan Phillips, who's a spokesperson for Labour against anti-Semitism. Right. Now, Ewan Phillips has been approached about this. He's been asked, and he said, yes, I've created this identity. I never pretended to be Jewish while I was doing so, although I think most people will see that name, or a lot of people will read that name and say, Goldstein sounds pretty Jewish. So what you have somebody who's made up the name David Goldstein to submit a complaint of anti-Semitism against an elderly Jewish woman who said Israel is an apartheid state. That elderly Jewish woman on her deathbed is investigative anti-Semitism. One of the last things she ever writes is a letter to the Labour Party explaining why she's an anti-Semitic, and then she dies. And it gets even worse. It gets even worse because her son, who agreed to be interviewed for the book, and I met him in person for the first time last night, and it was very emotional, was deeply offended by the situation. And he was so hurt by the fact that his mother was being accused of anti-Semitism and died under investigation for anti-Semitism that he wrote to the Labour Party, and he said to the Labour Party repeatedly, please, she's dead. She's clearly anti-Semitic. Please close this case. Please just tell me that at least internally you've resolved this, you've closed this, you've dealt with it somehow. I want to get some closure on this. And nobody has ever responded to him in the Labour Party. He wrote directly to Keir Starmer, and Keir Starmer didn't respond. Then he got friends in his constituency who knew Keir Starmer to write to Keir Starmer, and Keir Starmer didn't respond. And those are the sort of malignant outcomes that come, I think, from the way in which anti-Semitism in the Labour Party was used and abused. And I think, and the reason I tell that story is because I think it speaks to the HRC example of them recklessly, they say this is very serious, and then within half an hour, they're undermining the seriousness of what they've said is serious by breaking all those rules. And then this sort of thing happens. I think it speaks to an almost an inhumanity, but also just a total lack of ethical scruples about a really fundamental, key material issue that people do face anti-Semitism. It undermines the fight against anti-Semitism so profoundly that sometimes I'm just gobsmacked by it. Sometimes I don't know how to even interpret it and understand it.
Astonishing. I mean, I know about you and Philip as well. When, for example, at the end of 2018, when I was on live television and I was being yelled abuse at by far right Donald Trump supporting, Tommy Robinson supporting people who assembled outside College Green, and Ewan Phillips posted mocking that fact. When I challenged him on it, he sent some long rambling threat to sue me, which I can tell you did not go anywhere. I just want to sort of finally, just to show just examples of what we're dealing with here, but I mean, just hideous that story you just told, a really grim, bleak story. Just finally, I want to just, in terms of the position that Israel has taken, Israel, that's a Freudian slip. Labour's taken on Israel and its genocide against the Palestinian people, and how that's had an impact. I mean, we've seen Labour have, we saw from the very beginning there, Keir Starmer justified Israel imposing a siege on a civilian population and then claiming he didn't. But just in terms of what do your findings tell us about the position that Labour took on Israel's genocide against the Palestinian people over the last 2 years?
Sure, and I should make it very clear that in the book I'm extremely damning of first of all, Israel's conduct in Gaza, which is plainly, to my mind, one of the worst things I've ever seen in my life. And I think the evidence of it being a genocide is, I think pretty overwhelming at this point. And clearly the Labour Party effectively enables that for a long period of time. For the first, before Keir Starmer takes over as Prime Minister, he's effectively running cover. He says, Israel has that right in that famous interview. He refuses to back a ceasefire motion in November. He does an absolutely disgraceful performance in Parliament in February, where he effectively, they kill that SNP motion, primarily because that SNP motion acknowledged the collective punishment of Gazans, and he wanted that out of the motion. And it was really just a truly, just a deeply unpleasant and upsetting and unethical part of our British political history. Now, it's hard to explain precisely why these people decide to be complicit, right? And I think there's a whole host of reasons why I think they have decided to not properly stand up to Israel around these things, and they haven't stopped the F-35 shipments. They've exerted almost no diplomatic pressure that we can really tell. And part of it is, one is just a very simple one, which is I think Keir Starmer is a bit of a coward. I think the other one is that they are desperate to tuck behind the United States, no matter what the United States does. And the United States has always had a position to support Israel. But I do think that the anti-Semitism crisis played a pretty fundamental role in the response to Gaza. Because what it does at the very beginning is I think it sets the posture of the Labour Party in relation to Israel. Because one of the upshots of the anti-Semitism crisis is it effectively became almost impossible to have a robust criticism of Israel and not at least be accused of anti-Semitism in the Labour Party. We're actually kicked out of the party, right? So in that moment of crisis, I think that guides some of the thinking. And then it's actually been explicitly briefed from Starmer's office. It was in Anushka Starner's documentary. I think I've read a couple of other places where they say what Keir Starmer was motivated by in that moment, especially when they have that bad interview and thereafter, was that he felt that he so desperately needed to repair the damage that had been done between the Labour Party and the Jewish community under Jeremy Corbyn, that he had felt that he had to behave the way that he did. And I've sat with that for a long time, and I thought about it for a long time, because it's the wrong formulation. Because actually the formulation is that Keir Starmer felt that he needed to repair a relationship between the Labour Party and the Jewish community that Morgan McSweeney, via his various campaigns behind the scenes, was inflaming. Right? When people say that the Labour Party and Jeremy Corbyn was deeply anti-Semitic and the Keir Starmer had to repair that relationship by supporting Israel, what they're actually saying, if you actually know the history of what happened, is that Keir Starmer had to support a genocide in order to calm the fears of a Jewish community that had been stoked by Morgan McSweeney in secret, behind the scenes, while he wasn't declaring money to the Electoral Commission. Right? That, for me, is the outcome of the Labour Together project. That's why it's not just a story about illegality, and it's not just a story about taking over the Labour Party with lies. It has a material impact 4 years later, because at the moment there is like a crisis in Israel. There's a crisis that has to be dealt with. The anti-Semitism crisis that Morgan McSweeney has secretly helped to inflame with his colleagues is what constrains and directs the Labour Party's response to it. And that response is awful. And that response leads to material outcomes. That response leads to mass murder and death. It leads to war crimes and leads to plausible genocide. So it's not just they broke the rules. It's not just they lied a bit. Don't all politicians lie? I keep on getting asked that question. No, it's because the things they were doing back then, the way they ran the party, all the way up until now, in this moment of crisis, produced this reaction. And this reaction is abominable. And it's part of our job of seeking, I believe, accountability for the way these people took power and how they've wielded power, that we need to understand the roots of their response to something as awful as Israel.
Amen to that. Devastating stuff. It's a devastating book. And I have to say, really exposes political journalism in this country as well. Because what we've seen, it's so-called political journalism. I mean, we it's very clear for a while, and the likes of Peter Oborne, the brilliant journalist, has long made clear, we have client journalism where you have this extremely close relationship between political journalists and those in power, but more specifically, that many of the so-called political lobby, the political correspondents themselves have a burning hatred of the left, and that happens to coincide with the political project of Starmer. And they looked at Starmerism as, the way they saw it is that the left isn't politically legitimate, and it's good politics to crush the left. That's how they saw. That's how they kind of presented it, and therefore they didn't. The fact that Keir Starmer's team lied through their teeth about the leadership campaign, that wasn't worth probing because they saw that simply as good politics. That's why, they crushed the left. They lied, all the rest of it. Good. That shows they're savvy politicians or whatever. So what they've seen is all this scandalous stuff, which could have been uncovered. And, you're not a well-connected political journalist. He's got all these politicians on speed dial. You're a very good, extremely good journalist who puts all these other journalists to shame. But you do expose as well the terrible failings of political journalism, because you've done the job that an army of journalists should have done. And if they'd done their job, then the Starmer project would never have got away with it. And that's just a fact. So everyone, do make sure you get a copy of Paul Holden's The Fraud. And I know it's selling like nobody's business because everyone wants a copy now. It's an absolutely crucial piece of political literature, which will long be remembered as a massive contribution to understanding the politics of the very fraught politics of the time in which we live in. So do share the video, press like and subscribe, leave your thoughts and your comments. But Paul, congratulations on your book, and thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you so much.